Spirit, therefore, here appears as an artificer, and its action whereby it produces itself as object, but without having yet grasped the thought of itself, is an instinctive operation, like the building of a honeycomb by bees. Paragraph 691 is now going to lead us into the third part of the natural religion subsection of this, penultimate religion section of the work. Natural religion itself is not that long. There's important stuff happening in there, but you could say from a Hegelian perspective, it's not as important, in part because not as developed as what is going to be happening in the subsequent two subsections, religion, the religion of art, or religion through art, and then revealed religion. So here we're dealing with, as Hegel is going to say here, something that's instinctual or instinctive, instinctartiges, and we'll talk about that in a moment. It's just not as fully developed. Thought in the full sense is not as involved here. And, we might say, well, who does Hegel have in mind when we're talking about, what we've got translated here is the artificer, or religion as the product of the artificer, the Werkmeister. And, one strong suggestion is, well, we're talking about basically everything that's not the Greeks or Judaism and Christianity, and doesn't fall into the other sections earlier, like, Zoroastrianism with the religion of light. And there's something to that, right? Others say what he really has in mind here is Egyptian religion, where there is a strong focus on developing statuary, developing shapes, think about the pyramids and other things. Well, the Sphinx, right? So he's going to tell us about a few parts of this, but it's actually still remaining rather abstract. So I think it's important that we turn to looking at the determination that Spirit is taking on here. So, if we look back at the previous paragraph, right, he's talking about productive activity, not a perfect but conditioned activity, the fashioning of a material ready to hand. That's where we're getting this instinctive operation that's happening at the very end of this very short paragraph. And, what does that mean? That there's a less intentionality. Spirit is, by not engaging in thought, Spirit is thinking, but it's only thinking about how can I use this stuff that I have, you might even say, ready at hand, what I can quarry in this immediate area or get brought in. How can I fashion that into the things that don't require me to stretch my mind quite as far to think about my own working as a worker, right? So he says, Spirit appears as an artificer, a Werkmeister. And it's worth dwelling on the distinction that, is getting made here in the text. Werkmeister is not the same thing as Künstler, somebody who is making artwork, right? And in that case, later on, we're not just going to be talking about statuary, but also like poetry. And so there's a number of different media in which artwork can take place. The Werk, the working of some material into an object, that is, from a Hegelian perspective, less developed. It's lower, right? It's still the pinnacle for certain civilizations in terms of what we have, in terms of religion, but it's not that important. So he says, it appears as an artificer, its action, the action of production, by which it produces itself as object, but without having yet grasped the thought of itself, right? So it's not as self-aware, it's not as reflective, it's not problematizing as we see, for example, in epic poetry. The nature of epic poetry itself. It's just doing the things that it does. So in this section, we're going to have these various kinds of doings going on that are essentially determined by what kind of workers we have, what kind of masters of the working we have, and what materials, and then what conceptions they have in mind to exploit. So we get an object, a Gegenstand, which allows spirit to be able to picture itself to itself. And we should pause here and think, well, okay, is the only person who's religious the person who's fabricating, say, idols? No, obviously it's the people who value them and the people who use them in their worship and carry them from place to place. So it's not just the worker, but the worker is kind of like an emblem. And we could say it's less about the worker, him or herself, and more about what they're able to produce, the object. Now, this instinctive operation, right? Instinktartiges Arbeiten. It's Arbeiten, there's labor involved in this. Instinktartiges, of the sort that is instinct-driven or instinct-determined rather than deliberately thought through. Obviously, if there's a statue that's being produced of a god and it's uniting human and animal forms, or if there's some geometry involved in the construction of an obelisk or a pyramid, it's not totally instinctual, like as Hegel says, bees making honeycombs. But there is something like that going on. It's, you could say, conditioned thought. It's not going anywhere near as far as the artistic production that we're going to see later on goes. The first form, because it is immediate, is the abstract form of the understanding, and the work is not yet in its own self filled with spirit. The crystals of pyramids and obelisks, simple combinations of straight lines with plane surfaces, and equal proportions of parts in which the incommensurability of the round is destroyed, these are the works of this artificer of rigid form. On account of the merely abstract intelligibleness of the form, the significance of the work is not in the work itself, is not the spiritual self. Thus, either the works receive spirit into them only as an alien departed spirit that has forsaken its living saturation with reality and, being itself dead, takes up its abode in this lifeless crystal, or they have an external relation to spirit as something which is itself there externally and not as spirit. They are related to it as to the dawning light which casts its significance on them. In paragraph 692, Hegel is now going to begin walking us through more specific shapes. They are still quite general, but more specific shapes that the religion of the artificer is taking on. And then what this means is ways in which spirit is coming to understand itself. Not completely, as a matter of fact, not even halfway, we can say in this, but, it's getting to something more developed on the way. So here we're actually talking about the very first, though, so don't expect an awful lot out of this. And he tells us that this is immediate, right, unmediated, and it's the abstract form of the understanding. So, whenever something is abstract for Hegel, it's a starting point or it's the product of a process of abstraction. And we should mention, too, that for Hegel, you see this running throughout the rest of his works, and this is part of German idealism more broadly. There is a distinction between the understanding, right, Verstand, and reason, a higher faculty, Vernunft. And the understanding does things in ways that don't make it to the point of Vernunft, right, of reason. So conceptual understanding is not something that's really available. Instead, it's what he's been calling Vorstellung, representation, picture, language, however you want to frame it, That is germane to the understanding. In the lectures on the philosophy of religion, Hegel makes this, crystal clear being kind of a pun here because we're soon going to be talking about crystals. And by the way, not the crystals of New Agey sort of stuff, although maybe Hegel would consider that in some respects a reversion back to this, but other types of crystalline structures. And so we've got this abstract form of the understanding, and what it's going to do is use its own concepts and categories to project something onto reality as that which is to be made, that which is to be fashioned, worked upon. So he tells us that this is the abstract form of the understanding. The work is not yet in its own self filled with spirit. This is really the key point of this paragraph and indeed of this section itself, as we're going to see in the paragraphs yet to come. So there is this process of production, and what are we producing as the religious objects? Things that have the shapes of crystals. And what's characteristic of crystals? Other than, looking really cool because they're colorful usually, right? There isn't any discussion of color here. It's really about shape. It's about making geometry happen in nature. Now with crystals, geometry or geometrical simple shapes are happening in nature, usually not like super simple shapes. We're not usually getting just four-sided figures. Any of you who are, remembering tabletop role-playing and the many-sided dice, right? You have a four-sided die, which is really a pyramid. Then you can have, the cube, six-sided, and you can have eight-sided and 10-sided and 12-sided and 20-sided. You can even find like a 100-sided die, which really approximates to a ball in many respects. All of those things are essentially crystalline shapes. They're solids that represent something. And so the human being as a worker is now producing those as artistic objects, and not just in handicraft, but on a huge scale. So, when we're talking about pyramids, and we do see pyramids in many cultures. And, it's interesting, a bit of a side note. Some people have been like, wow, that must mean that they all learned from each other or some common stock, or maybe aliens came down. No, pyramids are a fairly simple way to stack bricks and then to make a shape. A ziggurat is a kind of pyramid. That's sort of a step temple that we find in Mesopotamia. The pyramids that we find in Mesoamerica, those in Egypt, right? All of these are feasible because these reflect certain things that we human beings can figure out how to do. It doesn't require that you learned it from, some godlike alien or anything like that, or that you had some weird cultural transmission that is, historically implausible. So we make these crystalline things, and like Hegel says, what's really characteristic of these, and how does this tie in with the understanding? There's two characteristics. These have simple combinations of straight lines with plane surfaces and equal proportion of parts. It's a way in which we introduce geometry into the world that we're experiencing, right? And now, this is a little funny because we could say, well, there are circles. Hegel's saying that this is a deviation from the incommensurability of roundness. But, we might think about, stone circles, right? But let's put that aside because maybe Hegel didn't have that sort of thing in mind. So he says that these are the works of this artificer of rigid form. So there's no tension in these. There's no dynamic way of framing them. There's no, pulling the eye in and producing some sort of effects. They just are what they are, right? They're very simple and straightforward, even though they may require a lot of labor. And they are indeed a result of human activity. They are indeed a shape of spirit. They are indeed an advance over nothing, right? So let's not knock them all together. But they don't provide spirit you could say, with a adequate vehicle for understanding itself. So here he tells us, on account of the merely abstract intelligibleness of the form, right? Being able to understand it. The intelligibleness, understanding, you should understand those as going together. The significance of the work is not in the work itself. That's a problem. The significance of the work, the meaning of the work, is not in what has been produced. So, in a way, this is going to be an interesting progression, but it's going to be also a bit of a dead end. So he tells us, it's not the spiritual self. Why not? Well, there's two different possibilities. So either the works receive spirit in them only as an alien departed spirit, or he jumps ahead and says they're related to it as the dawning light, right? So neither of these is really going to be what we want, but they are ways in which, early human beings were able to understand themselves in relation to the religious objects. So, like he says, here's the first option. They receive spirit into themselves as only an alien, departed spirit that has forsaken its living saturation with reality and being itself dead, right, inert, passed on, it takes up its abode in this lifeless crystal. So we might think of, in terms of the pyramid, the resting place for the pharaoh who is like a god on earth, surrounded by all sorts of illuminated pictures of other gods. He's joining them, or she's joining them, whoever's joining them, but they're dead. And that's it. There's nothing more that's going to happen. There's nothing that's going to move us, respond to us. And at best, we can hope to accompany the pharaoh on their journey. Maybe what would an obelisk preserve? I mean, think about some of the ones that were erected to celebrate victories. They keep somebody's memory, their great godlike deeds alive. Yeah, okay. For a while, right? Until the next conqueror comes around. So he says that's one possibility. Or they have an external relation to spirit as something which is there externally and not as spirit. How can spirit not be spirit? Well, it's present in a way that doesn't do justice to spirit. And so he says they're related to it as the dawning light, which casts its significance on them. This is a reference back to the, religion of light. And this is something external. So you've got the nice religious artifacts here, architecture, and light gets cast on it, allows you to see it, but that's it. And so we're not getting spirit in any significant sense through this stage. The division from which the artificer spirit starts, the in itself which becomes the material it fashions, and the being for self, which is the aspect of self-consciousness at work, this division has become objective to it in its work. Its further efforts must aim at getting rid of this division of soul and body, to clothe and give shape to soul in its own self, and to endow body with soul. The two aspects, in being brought closer to each other, retain the specific character of spirit as ideally conceived and as its enveloping husk. Spirit's unity with itself contains this antithesis of individuality and universality. Since the work in the coming together of its aspects comes closer to itself, this at the same time produces another result, namely that the work comes closer to the self-consciousness performing it, and that the latter in the work comes to know itself as it is in its truth. But in this way, the work at first constitutes only the abstract aspect of the activity of spirit, which does not yet know the content of this activity within itself, but in its work, which is a thing. The artificer himself, spirit in its eternity, has not yet appeared, but is the still inner hidden essence, which as an entirety is present only as divided into active self-consciousness and the object it has produced. Paragraph 693 is going to get us past the sterility of this first dependence upon geometric form as the object that the artificer, the Werkmeister, is creating for centering spirit in religion. And we're going to see that there's now two key sides that are being brought together and perhaps even reconciled in religious production, worship, however we want to conceive of this. But we have to be very careful. What's happening here is, in some respect, a looking ahead to the section yet to come, and Hegel's laying it out and then saying, oh, that's not happening yet. So, very, very typical Hegel move. So let's take a look at what he says. There's this division, right? And this is not a distinction, an Unterschied, right? This is instead a separation out of two things. The division from which, he says, the artificer spirit starts. Now, artificer spirit is how Miller is translating a little bit fast and loose, Arbeitende Geist. Now, it's true that it is the Werkmeister, the artificer, who is carrying out the labor, the Arbeiten in this case, and this is spirit who is doing this through the artificer. But, it's not wrong, but it's a little bit of a deviation here. So he says this division, what is the division into? So being in itself, an sich Seins, which becomes the material it fashions, and being for self, für sich Seins, which is the aspect of self-consciousness at work. He says this division has become objective to it in its work. So what does that mean for a division, or a separating out to become objective to it? It's been made into something that it can visualize, it can see, it can realize, it can conceptualize in the thing that has been created, the work, the Werk, right? The thing that the Werkmeister engages in, and that other people then are going to use as an object of religious devotion, worship, and conceptual approaches to the deity. So there's this division. And this may not be a division for the worshipers. Maybe that's why Hegel doesn't talk about them at all. But it is for the person who is fabricating whatever it's going to be. The statue, the architecture, the pyramid, the obelisk. All of those things are the matter that is being transformed. So he tells us, now here's where he gets an interesting metaphor. Its further efforts must aim at getting rid of this division. Now he doesn't say division of being in itself and being for itself. And now he says body and soul. So this is, kind of an interesting choice here, especially since he's going to also introduce another distinction that goes along with this between universal and particular. Body and soul are not universal and particular, are they? Is the material that's being fashioned the body in the sense of being a living organic thing? And is the aspect of self-consciousness at work the soul? Well, that's a little bit easier, right? Because yes, the soul understands itself. The body doesn't understand itself except through the intermediary of the soul. But, what we've talked about here just a moment ago was inert stuff that could at best be inhabited by a dead spirit. Now we're getting living things. So he says, to clothe and give shape to soul in its own self, endow body with soul. We want a reconciliation here. Each of them needs something from the other. And then here he says the two aspects in being brought closer to each other, which is a key, idea here. Things are being brought closer. They're being integrated with each other. Retain the specific character of spirit as ideally conceived and as its enveloping husk. So body presumably is the enveloping husk, and spirit's unity, the spirit as ideally conceived must be the soul in this case. And he tells us that spirit's unity with itself contains, now here's where he says something a little weird, this antithesis, Gegensatz, of universal and individual. Which of them is universal? Well, is it the material thing? That's not really universal. But in a way it is universal. You could have the same kind of shape. Or is it the aspect of self-consciousness at work? That sounds more individual or individuated, does it not? We'll put that off for just a moment. So he says, since the work in this coming together of these aspects comes closer to itself. Well, that's an interesting thing to say. It makes sense for the spirit to come closer to itself. It makes sense for these things to come closer to themselves in, being brought into being as the thing. But how does the thing, the work, the object of worship, become closer to itself? Well, because it does contain spirit. It is the result of spirit. There's something that's being found there. So he says the work comes closer to the self-consciousness performing it, and the latter in the work comes to know itself as it is in its truth. Now that is important. Once again, we're not talking about the community, we're not talking about the worshipers, we're talking about the artificer coming to know who the artificer is in the work that he or she does, and thereby coming to know spirit as something that could be worshipped. So imagine, a statue producer who does see the fact that this is, materials that they're transforming before they carve the wood into the statue. It's just wood, right? And painted and all that. And they know their own labor involved in it and the thought that's going into it. But it produces something that's greater than that. It's almost like a Pygmalion kind of story, isn't it? So he goes on and he tells us, here we go. In this way, the work at first constitutes only the abstract aspect of the activity of spirit, which does not yet know the content of this activity within itself, but in its work, which is a thing. The artificer himself, notice what he's saying. The artificer himself, the worker, does know himself. We've already established that. This is self-consciousness at work. The artificer, capital A, or in this, the German, capital W, although, it's already capitalized, so maybe super capital W, the worker that is spirit in its entirety has not yet appeared, but is the still inner hidden essence, which is an entirety, is present only as divided into active self-consciousness and the object it has produced, which are now still present to each other in a opposition. The surrounding habitation, then, the outer reality which has been raised at first only into the abstract form of the understanding, is fashioned by the artificer into a more lifelike form. For this purpose, he employs plant life, which is no longer sacred as it was to the earlier impotent pantheism. On the contrary, the artificer who grasps himself as the being that is for itself takes that plant life as something to be used and reduces it to an outer aspect, to a mere ornament. But it is not used unaltered, for the artificer of the self-conscious form at the same time destroys the transitoriness inherent in the immediate existence of this life and brings its organic forms nearer to the more rigid and more universal forms of thought. The organic form, which left to itself, proliferates unchecked in particularity, being itself subjugated by the form of thought, in turn raises these rectilinear flat shapes into a roundness more typical of the organic form, a blending which becomes the root of free architecture. Now in paragraph 694, we see some new developments. Hegel is having the artificer bring in something other than just geometric, natural objects, which, leave room for religion of light and this very simple sort of architecture and shapes. And now we get organic forms. You notice here that Hegel is, in some respects, retracing the section that we just went through with plant and animal, because in this paragraph he's going to talk about plants. Then in the next paragraph, it's going to be animals. So the artificer, Werkmeister, the person who produces the work, is now dealing with a similar sort of thing that we saw in the last paragraph, a being in itself, a being for itself, that are brought together, the material and the work of self-consciousness, or if you like, the body and the soul, but it's happening in terms of plant life. And so he says, the surrounding habitation, the outer reality, which has been raised into the abstract form of the understanding, is fashioned by the artificer into a more lifelike form. Now, that's something worth thinking about. Obviously, the artificer is not creating plant life, right? He is only reproducing it. He is only picturing it. But it is something new, something that it is transforming the ways in which the objects of religion, the things that are being fixated on, are being grasped and understood. So it's no longer worshiping plants, it's worshiping the images of plants, the Vorstellungen of plants, right? So he says, for this purpose, he employs plant life. And there's an important transformation happening here. It's no longer sacred as it was to the earlier impotent pantheism. So it's no longer the plants as such, just by themselves, that are sacred. Now it's the essence of them, the representation of them, what it is that the Werkmeister is able to do with them. And you notice that it's not going to be just reproduction of plants as such, as if, in order to worship maize, or the maize god, you have to make the entire plant structure and then, the ears of corn or something like that. No, there's going to be elements of it, aspects of it that get incorporated. And this is quite important. So he says, on the contrary, the artificer grasps himself as the being that is for itself, right, through their activity. They take that plant life as something to be used, and they reduce it to an outer aspect, to a mere ornament. And ornamentation is going to be one of the things that happens. So we could have, for example, a pyramid, but we could have plant forms within the pyramid structure in some way. Ornamentation. Now, ornamentation, it's not affecting the structure of the thing itself. It's just like extra stuff that we're putting on. He says it's not used unaltered. The artificer of the self-conscious form at the same time destroys the transitoriness inherent in the immediate existence of this life. What does that mean? Plants die, right? Plants change over time. Again, if we want to use maize or corn as an example, we have a saying here in the Midwest, knee-high by the 4th of July. You want the corn to be at least knee-high, or else you're not going to have a very good harvest. And then it shoots up, and it's, taller than me by the time that it's fully grown, and the tassels appear, and it starts pollinating and then making the ears. It doesn't stay the same from day to day. I mean, there's an expression here, it's so humid you can hear the corn growing, right? If that's the case, then it's not remaining the same. There's a transitoriness to it. By putting it into stone, by putting it into wood, by putting it into artistic reproduction through paints, we're holding it still. We're idealizing it. Think about vines as another prime example, right? You see that in a lot of artwork throughout the ancient world. So he says, we destroy the transitoriness and bring its organic forms nearer the more rigid and universal forms of thought. So there's something going on here. We're using what we learned before and now making things remain still, remain the same. It says, the organic form which left to itself proliferates unchecked in particularity, being subjugated by the form of thought, raises these rectilinear flat shapes into a roundness more typical of the organic form, a blending which becomes the root of free architecture. So the first stage, where we're dealing with these geometric forms and plant life are being brought together now, integrated into a kind of harmony that yields us first ornamentation, then organic forms, and then provides us with the root of what Hegel is calling free architecture. So this is a very important second stage of transition in terms of the works that are being produced by the Artificer.